The Vampire King's hand found the curve of the marble banister without hesitation, his movements so fluid that no one would ever suspect he was navigating his own palace in complete darkness. Valerius Whitethorne had been blind for 3 months, 17 days, and approximately 9 hours, though he'd never admit it to a living soul. Not to his council, not to his enemies circling like vultures beyond the borders of his territory, and certainly not to the human woman currently setting fresh flowers in the vase by his library window, the woman whose heartbeat he'd memorized so thoroughly he could track her location anywhere in the castle. "Your Majesty, I've finished with the East Wing," Jenna Brooks said, her voice carrying that peculiar mixture of nervousness and determination that had intrigued him since the employment agency sent her 3 months ago. 3 months. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Adequate," Valerius replied, keeping his face angled toward where he knew the window stood, letting the afternoon light, which he couldn't see but could feel burning against his skin, cast his profile in what he knew would be an appropriately regal silhouette. He'd spent 2 centuries perfecting that look. He wasn't about to lose it to something as inconvenient as blindness. The truth was that Jenna's work was far better than adequate. She was meticulous, thoughtful, and possessed an instinct for beauty that most of his kind had lost somewhere in their immortal years. She arranged things in ways that made sense, kept schedules he could predict, and most importantly, she always put items back exactly where she'd found them. For a blind vampire king trying to maintain the illusion of sight, she was nothing short of salvation. "I noticed the painting in the blue room was crooked," Jenna said, and he heard her footsteps approaching. Light steps, a slight hesitation in the left foot that suggested an old injury. "Did you want me to straighten it, or were you planning to have it repositioned?" Valerius hadn't known the painting was crooked. He hadn't been able to see it in months, but he'd memorized the exact number of steps from his bedroom door to that painting, knew the texture of its frame, the scent of the oil paint beneath the varnish. "Leave it," he said with calculated indifference. "I'm considering having the entire collection rehung." "Oh," was that disappointment in her voice. "That's a shame. The composition is really lovely as it is." He turned toward her voice, letting his eyes still the striking silver white that marked him as pure-blooded royalty settle approximately where her face should be. He'd gotten good at that, at looking at people without truly seeing them, at making his gaze seem sharp and penetrating, when really he was listening to the minute shifts in breathing, the rustle of clothing, the whisper of air displacement that told him where someone stood. "You have opinions on my art collection, Miss Brooks?" I'm sorry, Your Majesty. That was inappropriate." "I didn't say it was inappropriate. I asked if you had opinions." He heard her swallow, heard the slight catch in her breath. Fear? No, not quite. Uncertainty mixed with something bolder. "I think whoever arranged your collection had an exceptional eye for balance and narrative flow. The pieces speak to each other across the rooms. It would be a loss to disrupt that conversation." Despite everything, despite the curse slowly killing him, despite the enemies who'd poisoned him with a magical toxin designed to strip him of his senses before taking his life, despite the desperate facade he maintained every waking moment, Valerius felt his mouth curve into something dangerously close to a genuine expression. "You think my paintings have conversations, don't you?" She moved closer, and he caught her scent. Vanilla and old books, soap and something uniquely her. Human, warm, alive. The portrait in the entrance hall, the woman in silver, she's looking toward the east corridor. And the landscape at the end of that corridor shows the same mountains that are visible through her window. It's like she's gazing at her homeland. Someone planned that. He had planned that. 70 years ago, when his eyes still functioned and he'd amused himself arranging and rearranging his collections. The portrait was of his sister, dead now for a century, and the landscape was indeed the view from her childhood room. "You're observant, Miss Brooks." "I clean your house, Your Majesty. Observing things is quite literally my job." There it was again, that thread of boldness wrapped in respectful words. Most humans who found themselves employed in vampire households either cowered in terror or became obsequiously fawning. Jenna did neither. She maintained a professional distance while somehow still being present, real. Indeed, he moved past her, counting steps, remembering the exact layout of the furniture. 12 paces to the desk, angle slightly left to avoid the reading chair he'd positioned there in 1847. "That will be all for today. I have council business to attend to." "Of course. Should I prepare the council chamber?" "No need. I'll handle it myself." He always handled the council chamber himself now, arriving early to ensure he knew exactly where every chair stood, where the documents would be placed, how the light fell through the windows. He'd mapped every room he regularly used with obsessive precision, turned his entire existence into a choreographed performance where every movement was rehearsed, every glance calculated. He listened to Jenna's retreating footsteps, counting them automatically. 53 steps to the door, a pause while she retrieved her supply cart from the hallway, then the soft click of the door closing behind her. Only then did Valerius allow himself to stop performing. His shoulders dropped fractionally, and he turned his face toward where he knew the window stood, letting the sunlight he couldn't see burn against skin that registered pain, but not sight. The poison had been clever, a magical compound slipped into his wine at a diplomatic dinner 4 months ago. It had been designed to strip his senses one by one before finally killing him. First taste, then smell, then sight. Hearing and touch would be next, and then nothing. An ignoble death for a vampire king who'd ruled the Eastern Territories for 200 years. He'd executed the assassin naturally, but not before learning that the poison had come from the Western court. From Demetrius, his oldest rival, who'd been waiting decades for an opportunity to claim Valerius's territories. Demetrius, who would strike the moment he sensed weakness, who had spies everywhere, who would absolutely destroy Valerius's kingdom if he knew its king was operating blind. So Valerius had adapted, memorized, practiced, turned himself into an actor playing the role of a seeing man, and so far the performance had been flawless, mostly flawless. "Your Majesty?" The voice came from the doorway, Theron, his captain of the guard. "The council convenes in an hour." "I'm aware, Theron." "Of course. I've also received reports of movement along the western border. Demetrius's forces are conducting what they claim are routine exercises." "Routine." Valerius allowed contempt to color the word. "How many troops?" 3 battalions. More than necessary for exercises." "He's testing us. He wants to see how we respond." Valerius moved toward where he knew his desk stood, trailing his fingers along its edge with a gesture that would look thoughtful to anyone watching. In reality, he was using it to orient himself, to confirm his position in the room. "Double our border patrols, but make it look casual. I want Demetrius to think we're unconcerned." "Sir, if I may speak frankly." "You may." "Demetrius has been increasingly bold since the summit. There are rumors he knows about the assassination attempt, about the poison." "There are always rumors, Theron. These are specific, Your Majesty. And if he does know, if he suspects you're weakened—" "Do I seem weakened to you?" Valerius turned toward where Theron's voice originated, fixing him with a stare that had made lesser vampires flinch for centuries. He couldn't see Theron's reaction, but he heard the slight catch in the other vampire's breath. "No, Your Majesty. You seem as formidable as ever." "Then that will have to suffice. Dismissed." After Theron left, Valerius sank into his desk chair and allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. His head ached a phantom pain where his eyes insisted on trying to see through the darkness the poison had created. His healer, Lyris, had told him the toxin was still progressing, still eating away at his remaining senses. She estimated he had perhaps 2 months before his hearing went, and another month after that before death claimed him entirely. Unless, of course, Demetrius attacked first. Then he'd be dead much sooner. The cruelest part was that a cure existed. Lyris had been clear about that. The same Western court that had poisoned him held the antidote in their vaults, a fact Demetrius had undoubtedly orchestrated specifically. He wanted Valerius to come begging, to prostrate himself and show weakness before the entire vampire world. Valerius would rather die, which, practically speaking, he was doing. The council meeting that evening was an exercise in carefully controlled chaos. Valerius had timed his arrival perfectly, entering the chamber just as the bells struck 8, so that all eyes would be on him, so that his smooth navigation to his seat at the head of the table would be attributed to simple familiarity rather than desperate memorization. "Gentlemen, ladies," he said, his voice carrying the authority that came from 2 centuries of rule, I understand we have concerns regarding the western border." He couldn't see the nods, but he heard the murmur of agreement, the rustle of papers being arranged. He'd had Lyris read him the agenda 3 times until he'd memorized every point. Now he held forth on military positioning, trade negotiations, and territorial disputes, as though he could see the map spread before him, as though he knew exactly where everyone sat. He did know where everyone sat. He'd memorized that too. "The Western Court grows bold," said Councillor Ravenna, her voice sharp with concern. "Perhaps we should consider diplomatic outreach." "Appeasement," Valerius interrupted, "is not diplomacy. It's surrender by another name. Demetrius respects strength. We will show him strength. And if he attacks, that was Councillor Marcus, always the pragmatist, then we will remind him why the Eastern Territories have remained independent for 300 years. Valerius leaned back in his chair, the picture of confidence. Inside, he was calculating distances, tracking voices, building a mental map of the room's dynamics. We've weathered worse than a blustering fool with delusions of expansion. The meeting continued for 2 more hours. By the end, Valerius's head pounded with the effort of maintaining his performance, of tracking 7 different voices, of responding to verbal and nonverbal cues he couldn't see. But he'd pulled it off. Again, when he finally returned to his private chambers, he found them exactly as he'd left them, except for the subtle scent of vanilla and old books that told him Jenna had been there. He tracked the scent through the room and found its source. A vase of night-blooming jasmine on his bedside table, positioned exactly where his water glass usually sat. "Lyris," he called, knowing his healer would be nearby. She always was these days. "Your Majesty?" She appeared in the doorway between his chamber and her adjoining workroom. "Did you authorize the human girl to rearrange my personal chambers?" "No, Your Majesty. Shall I speak with her?" Valerius reached out, finding the vase with only a moment's searching. The flowers were fresh, the water cool. "She moved my water glass. I'll ensure it doesn't happen again. See that you do." But even as he said it, he was noting the precise position of the new vase, updating his mental map. The jasmine scent was strong enough that he could use it as a landmark, actually, a navigational point. Perhaps the rearrangement had been accidental genius. He dismissed Lyris and prepared for bed with the efficiency of long practice, counting steps to his wardrobe, his bathroom, his bed. Everything choreographed, everything controlled. That night, he dreamed of seeing Jenna's face, an irony, considering he'd never actually seen it. He knew the sound of her voice, the scent of her skin, the rhythm of her heartbeat, but her face was a mystery his dying eyes would never solve. When he woke, he was surprised to find himself mourning that loss almost as much as he mourned his dying kingdom. Over the following weeks, Valerius noticed a pattern. Jenna was rearranging things subtly, carefully, in ways that initially frustrated him until he realized what she was doing. She was making the castle easier to navigate. Fresh flowers with distinct scents appeared in key locations, their positions consistent. Heavy drapes were replaced with lighter ones that allowed more temperature variation, cold near windows, warmer near interior walls, giving him additional environmental cues. Furniture was adjusted to create clearer pathways while still maintaining aesthetic appeal. She had to know. Somehow the human cleaning woman had deduced what no vampire in his court had suspected. He should fire her immediately. She was a security risk, a liability. If she knew, she could tell others, and if others knew. But she hadn't told anyone. He'd had Theron investigate discreetly. Jenna Brooks, age 24, orphaned at 16, worked 3 jobs to pay off her late parents' medical debts. No political connections, no vampire associations, no suspicious contacts. Just a human woman trying to survive in a world that had become infinitely more dangerous since vampires had revealed themselves to humanity 5 years ago. She came to his chambers to collect the breakfast tray he hadn't touched. He'd lost his sense of taste early on, making eating a pointless exercise he engaged in only for appearances, and found him standing by the window. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "I hope the jasmine isn't too overpowering. I can replace it with something subtler." "It's fine." He didn't turn toward her. "Tell me, Miss Brooks, what do you think of my chambers?" A pause. He heard her heartbeat accelerate slightly. "I think they're beautiful, Your Majesty. Very precise. Precise, An interesting word choice. You seem to prefer things in specific places, consistency, order. And that strikes you as unusual? No. Her voice was steady now, losing its nervousness. I think it strikes me as sensible. When you're as busy as you are, as important as you are, you can't waste time searching for things. Everything should have its place. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, one that had nothing to do with blindness and everything to do with efficiency. Clever girl. You're perceptive, Miss Brooks. I try to be, Your Majesty. He turned toward her voice, letting his unseeing eyes find approximately where her face should be. How would you describe me, Miss Brooks? If someone asked you what I looked like, what would you say? He heard her breath catch, heard the slight shuffle of her feet against stone. Nervous again, but not fleeing. I would say you look like a king. White hair like starlight, silver eyes that seem to see everything, tall, commanding, beautiful in the way ancient things are beautiful marble statues, winter storms, things that are dangerous and perfect. You think I'm dangerous? Your Majesty, I think you're probably the most dangerous person I've ever met. Yet you're still here. Yes. Why? Another pause. Longer this time. Because dangerous doesn't mean cruel, and because someone needs to water the jasmine. Despite himself, Valerius laughed a short surprise sound he hadn't made in months. The jasmine. It's very particular about consistent moisture levels. I'll keep that in mind. He moved toward his desk, counting steps automatically. That will be all, Miss Brooks. Your Majesty, if I may, there's a ball next week, the autumn equinox celebration. Will you be needing the ballroom prepared? The ball. He'd forgotten about it, though of course it had been planned months in advance. A major social event, one he couldn't possibly cancel without raising questions. An evening of navigating crowds, avoiding dancers, tracking conversations in a room full of music and noise. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. Yes, he heard himself say, begin preparations tomorrow. After she left, he sat at his desk and contemplated the many ways this could end in disaster. The ballroom was massive, filled with architectural features he'd never bothered to memorize because he'd never needed to. There would be hundreds of guests, constantly moving, creating a chaotic soundscape that would make his usual navigation techniques useless. He was going to fail. The facade would crack and everyone would know, unless... Lyris, he called, and his healer appeared within moments. I need you to do something for me. Something unusual. That night, Valerius returned to the ballroom for the first time since losing his sight. With Lyris's help, he spent 4 hours mapping every inch of the space. The distance from the throne to the first pillar, 23 steps. The distance between pillars, 11 steps each. The raised dais where musicians would play, center of the north wall, 3 steps up. The refreshment tables, east and west walls, equidistant from the entrance. He traced his fingers over every surface, memorizing textures and temperatures. Smooth marble, rough stone, polished wood, cool metal. He had Lyris describe the visual layout in excruciating detail until he could picture it in his mind, not see it, but understand it spatially. For 7 nights, he practiced, walking the perimeter, navigating between pillars, finding the throne from various starting positions, again and again until muscle memory replaced sight, until he could move through the ballroom as smoothly as he moved through his own chambers. On the 8th morning, Jenna found him there. Your Majesty, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you'd be here. I can come back or stay. The word came out sharper than intended. He softened it with, I want your opinion on something. My opinion, Your Majesty? You have an eye for composition, you said, for narrative. Tell me what you see when you look at this room. He heard her move further into the ballroom, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. I see a room designed for grandeur, for making impressions. The pillars create natural conversation spaces while directing traffic flow. The throne is positioned to be visible from anywhere in the room. It's intimidating and inviting at the same time. And if you were attending a ball here, where would you want to stand? Probably near the pillars, close enough to participate but with an easy retreat route if needed. Wallflower positioning. She said it with self-deprecating humor. You don't strike me as a wallflower, Miss Brooks. You'd be surprised, Your Majesty. He moved toward her voice, stopping at what he judged to be a socially appropriate distance. What if you were dancing? Where in the room would you want to be? I don't really dance. I never learned properly. Surely you've danced before. At my high school prom, I swayed awkwardly while my date stepped on my feet. I'm not sure that counts. Valerius found himself extending his hand before he'd consciously decided to do so. Dance with me. Your Majesty, you said you never learned properly. Consider this an education. Take my hand, Miss Brooks. He felt her hesitate, felt the moment she decided to trust him. Her hand slipped into his warm, calloused from work, smaller than his own. Human. Alive. I don't hear any music, she said nervously. You don't need music to learn the steps. Place your other hand on my shoulder. I'll guide you. She did, and he felt the slight tremor in her touch. Fear? Excitement? Both, perhaps. He positioned his other hand at her waist, noting the sharp intake of breath the contact produced. The waltz is a conversation, he said, beginning to move in the pattern he'd learned centuries ago when he'd had eyes to see his partners. One person leads, the other follows. The leader's job isn't to control, but to communicate to signal intentions clearly enough that the follower can respond gracefully. He guided her through the basic steps, slow and patient. She stumbled at first, apologizing breathlessly, but he held her steady. Don't apologize. Mistakes are part of the learning process. Try again. They moved through the ballroom, and Valerius used the dance to reinforce his mental map. 13 steps east, turn. 15 steps south, turn. He was navigating, practicing, preparing, but he was also, he realized, enjoying himself. Jenna's heartbeat had settled into a steadier rhythm. She was learning quickly, adapting to his signals, beginning to trust his guidance. You're a good teacher, Your Majesty, she said quietly. You're a good student. Can I ask you something? You may ask, I may not answer. Why are you doing this, teaching me to dance? Because you're helping me survive, he thought. Because you've shown me more kindness in 2 months than most of my court has shown in decades. Because your heartbeat has become the most reliable constant in my carefully constructed world. Because, he said instead, everyone should know how to dance. They continued in silence after that, moving through the empty ballroom as invisible music played in both their heads. Valerius found himself counting her heartbeats instead of his steps, found himself leaning slightly closer to catch her scent of vanilla and books. Dangerous. This was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with his blindness and everything to do with the fragile human in his arms. That's enough for today, he said abruptly, stepping back. You have work to attend to, I'm sure. Yes, Your Majesty. Did she sound disappointed? He couldn't tell. Thank you for the lesson. After she left, Valerius stood alone in the ballroom and tried to remember the last time he'd felt anything approaching peace. It had been years. Decades, perhaps, certainly not since the poison had begun its slow destruction of his senses. The night of the autumn equinox ball arrived with all the inexorable certainty of a beheading. Valerius dressed in formal court attire, black jacket with silver embroidery, clothes selected more by texture than appearance since he couldn't verify the latter, and steeled himself for the performance of his life. Guests began arriving at sunset. Valerius positioned himself on his throne, a location he could find blind and sleeping, and prepared to hold court. Lord Christoph of the Northern Reaches, Theron announced, and Valerius turned toward the sound of approaching footsteps. Christoph, welcome. How fares the northern border? The evening proceeded in a carefully orchestrated dance, more complex than any waltz. Valerius tracked conversations by voice recognition, turned toward speakers by following sound, and maintained eye contact through educated guessing and decades of practice. When he rose to circulate, he kept near the walls and pillars, using them as landmarks. To all observers, he was the perfect host, attentive, engaged, commanding. Inside, he was counting steps and tracking sounds with every ounce of concentration he possessed. Then, disaster struck in the form of Lady Seraphine, a minor noble from a vassal house who chose to approach him from an unexpected angle while he was mid-conversation with Marcus. "Your Majesty!" she exclaimed, stepping directly into his path. He didn't see her, couldn't see her, and walked straight into her, nearly knocking her down in his attempt to recover. For one horrible moment, time seemed to freeze. He just crashed into a guest like a drunk or a fool. The entire ballroom must have seen. His cover was blown. Everything was, "My deepest apologies, Lady Seraphine," he said smoothly, reaching out to steady her with hands that found her shoulders through luck and quick reflexes. "I was too engrossed in my conversation with Marcus to notice your approach. How clumsy of me." "Oh, no, Your Majesty, it was my fault entirely. I shouldn't have rushed over so eagerly." He felt her curtsy under his hands, heard the flattered simper in her voice. She thought he'd been distracted by conversation, not handicapped by blindness. The moment passed. The disaster was averted, but it had been close, too close. "If you'll excuse me," he said, "I should attend to other guests." He made his way toward what he calculated was the exit, moving carefully, but his concentration was shattered. The soundscape of the ballroom, hundreds of conversations, music, footsteps, rustling clothing had become overwhelming. He couldn't track individual sounds anymore, couldn't orient himself properly. He was lost in his own ballroom. Then, impossibly, miraculously, a familiar heartbeat approached from his left. "Your Majesty?" Jenna's voice quiet and respectful. "I apologize for interrupting, but there's a matter requiring your attention. Would you follow me, please?" He seized on the lifeline like a drowning man. "Of course. Lead the way, Miss Brooks." She moved ahead of him. He could track her easily, that heartbeat he'd memorized, that scent of vanilla, and he followed, letting her guide him through the crowd and out of the ballroom. She led him down a corridor, around two corners, and into what his sense of smell identified as a small antechamber. "Thank you," he said quietly, once they were alone. "You seemed like you needed an escape route." "I did, very much so." He leaned against the wall, allowing himself a moment of genuine exhaustion. "What are you even doing at the ball? I didn't think cleaning staff attended these functions." "We don't, usually. But there was a minor emergency in the kitchen, and they needed extra hands. I've been running refreshments all evening." A pause. "Your Majesty, may I be bold? You've been bold since the day we met. Why stop now? You can't see, can you? You're blind." There it was, the truth spoken aloud for the first time since the poison had stolen his sight. He should deny it, should lie, should have her memory wiped by one of his compulsion-capable vampires. Instead, he said, "Yes, I'm blind." He heard her move closer, heard the rustle of her dress. She must be wearing formal attire for serving duties. "How long?" 3 months, since shortly before you arrived." The poison. That assassination attempt everyone whispered about. It didn't just make you ill, did it? No, it's killing me slowly. Taste first, then smell, then sight. Hearing and touch are next, and then... He made a vague gesture that encompassed death and everything that came with it. "Is there a cure?" "Yes, in the Western Court where my enemies live. I'd have to beg for it, show weakness, probably cede territory or power, so effectively no, there's no cure." That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Valerius actually laughed a sharp, bitter sound. "Excuse me? You're dying because you're too proud to ask for help? That's not noble, Your Majesty, that's just stupid. You don't understand vampire politics. I understand that politics don't matter much when you're dead." She was right in front of him now, close enough that he could feel her body heat. "Your Majesty, Valerius, you have people who depend on you. A kingdom. Responsibilities. You can't just let yourself die because asking for help would be embarrassing. It's more complicated than embarrassment. Is it? Or have you just convinced yourself it is because admitting you need something is harder than pretending you're invincible?" Her words hit harder than any physical blow could have, because she was right. On some level, he'd chosen pride over survival, had decided that dying as an undefeated king was preferable to living as one who'd shown weakness. "You don't understand what you're asking," he said quietly. "Maybe not, but I understand what I'm seeing. You've memorized every step of this castle. You've learned to navigate entirely by sound and touch. You've fooled every vampire in your court, maintained the illusion of sight so completely that no one suspects. That's not weakness, Your Majesty. That's the most impressive thing I've ever witnessed. It's a facade, a trick. It's adaptation, it's survival, it's strength. Her hand found his warm human, alive and squeezed gently. And if you can do all that blind, imagine what you could do with your sight restored. Even if I wanted to seek the cure, I couldn't. The moment I left my territory to travel west, Demetrius would know I was weakened. He'd attack while I was gone. My people would suffer. Then don't go yourself. Send an emissary, negotiate remotely. The Western Court would never agree to remote negotiations for something this significant. Then make them. You're a king. Find leverage. There has to be something Demetrius wants that you can offer. Valerius pulled his hand away and moved to where he sensed a chair, sinking into it heavily. Miss Brooks, I appreciate your concern, but this is not a situation that can be resolved with simple solutions and good intentions. No, it's a situation that can only be resolved if you actually try to resolve it. Right now, you're not trying. You're just waiting to die and calling it honor. You presume much for a human in service. You asked me to be bold. They stood or sat and stood in silence for a long moment. The sounds of the ball filtered through the walls, muffled music and laughter from people who had no idea their king was slowly dying in a side room while a human servant told him hard truths. Why do you care? Valerius asked finally. What do I matter to you? I don't know. Jenna's voice was soft, almost confused. I should be terrified of you, of all vampires, really. When your kind revealed yourselves, when we learned we weren't alone in the world, it was frightening. And you're a king, which makes you even more intimidating. But you're kind to me. You taught me to dance. You say please and thank you when you don't have to. And you're fighting so hard to survive while pretending you're not fighting at all. And that makes you, she trailed off, makes me what? Human, in the ways that matter. Valerius felt something crack inside his chest, some carefully maintained wall he'd built around emotions he couldn't afford to feel. I'm not human, Miss Brooks. I'm a monster playing at civility. If you were a monster, you wouldn't care about protecting your people. You'd just take the cure and let them face whatever consequences came. She was right. Again. When had this human woman become the voice of his conscience? I need to return to the ball, he said, standing. People will wonder where I've gone. Of course, Your Majesty. Was that hurt in her voice? Disappointment? He moved toward the door, counting steps, but paused with his hand on what he hoped was the handle. Miss Brooks, Jenna, thank you, for tonight, for the navigation aids you've been placing throughout the castle, for your discretion, for caring. You're welcome, Your Majesty. He found his way back to the ballroom. Jenna guided him part of the way, before disappearing back toward the kitchens and resumed his role as host. But something had shifted. Her words echoed in his mind, undermining the certainties he'd built up over months of slow dying. What if she was right? What if pride was just another word for giving up? The ball ended near dawn. Vampires could withstand sunlight for brief periods, though it was painful and weakening, so most guests departed before the first rays crested the horizon. Valerius bid farewell to the last stragglers and finally allowed himself to drop the facade. Lyris, he called, and his healer appeared. I need to know something. If I were to seek the cure from the Western Court, realistically, what would it take? Lyris was silent for a long moment. Your Majesty, we've discussed this. I know what we've discussed. I'm asking for a practical assessment, not a lecture on politics. Demetrius would demand you come in person. He'd want you vulnerable, on his territory, so he could leverage maximum concessions. He'd probably demand partial territory rights, trade advantages, possibly even a marriage alliance. And if I refused? Then he'd deny the cure and watch you die, then attack your weakened territory anyway. You've backed yourself into a corner, Your Majesty. There may not be a way out. After Lyris left, Valerius sat alone in his chambers and contemplated impossible choices. Die with pride intact, or live with compromised sovereignty, protect his kingdom by dying, or risk it by seeking to live. When had his life become a maze with no exit? Sleep claimed him eventually, and he dreamed of dancing in ballrooms he could see, with partners whose faces weren't mysteries. The next morning, everything changed. Valerius was in his study, ostensibly reviewing documents that Lyris read aloud to him when Theron burst in without announcement. "Your Majesty, we have a situation. Demetrius has sent an envoy. They're at the gates now, demanding an audience." Every instinct screamed trap. Did they state their business? They claim to have a proposal, one that benefits both courts. How convenient. I assume this proposal comes with teeth. "Almost certainly, Your Majesty." Valerius stood, automatically adjusting his jacket, orienting himself toward the door. "Very well. Have them brought to the formal receiving room. I'll grant them an audience." The formal receiving room was one he'd mapped extensively. It was where he conducted most diplomatic business, precisely because he knew every inch of it. When the Western Court envoy arrived, Valerius was positioned on his throne-like chair, the picture of relaxed authority. "Your Majesty," the envoy said, a female voice, cultured and cold, "I am Selene, first advisor to Lord Demetrius of the Western Court. I bring greetings and a proposal." "Speak, Selene. I'm listening." "My lord has heard disturbing rumors about your health. Rumors of poison, of failing senses, of weakness spreading through the eastern territories." Valerius kept his face impassive. "Rumors are plentiful and rarely accurate." "Indeed. Which is why Lord Demetrius wishes to offer assistance. We possess the cure to the poison that afflicts you, a poison which, I should mention, was not deployed with my lord's knowledge or approval. The assassin acted independently and has been punished." A likely story, but Valerius let it pass. How generous of Lord Demetrius to offer aid. Generous, yes, but not without price. My lord proposes an exchange. The cure for your sight, in return for your agreement to a marriage alliance. Of all the things Valerius had expected, this wasn't among them. A marriage alliance. Yes. Lord Demetrius has a sister, Lady Morgana. A union between the Eastern and Western courts would bring stability to the entire region, peace, prosperity, and an end to these tiresome border tensions. And I suppose Lady Morgana is amenable to marrying a blind king. The cure would be provided before any ceremony, naturally. You would be restored to full health and sight. It was a trap. Obviously, a trap. Demetrius wanted to link their territories, probably planned to have Valerius assassinated after the wedding, absorbing the eastern lands through his sister's claim. Or perhaps Morgana herself was the weapon a bride who'd finish what the poison had started. "I'll need time to consider this proposal," Valerius said carefully. "Of course, Lord Demetrius is nothing if not patient. Shall we say, a week for your response?" "A week is acceptable." After Selene left, Valerius sat in silence, weighing options that all seemed to lead toward destruction. Accept the marriage and likely die by assassination within a year. Refuse and die from poison within months. Either way, he died. "Your Majesty?" Jenna's voice hesitant from the doorway. "I came to clean, but if you need privacy..." "Come in, Miss Brooks. I find your presence clarifying at the moment." He heard her enter, heard the soft clink of cleaning supplies being set down. "I couldn't help but overhear some of what the envoy said. A marriage alliance?" "Yes, Demetrius wants to link our territories by having me marry his sister. In exchange, I receive the cure." "That sounds actually reasonable." "It sounds like an elaborate assassination plot. I'd be dead within a year of the wedding, and Morgana would inherit my territory as my widow." "Oh," she was quiet for a moment. "Could you negotiate different terms? Ask for the cure before agreeing to marriage, with a longer engagement period? That would only delay the inevitable. Maybe. Or maybe during that delay, you'd find a way to turn the situation to your advantage. You're clever, Your Majesty. You've hidden your blindness for months. Surely you can outmaneuver one ambitious vampire lord?" Valerius laughed despite himself. "You have remarkable faith in my abilities." "Because I've seen what you're capable of." She moved closer. He tracked her by heartbeat and scent. "You know what I think? I think you've spent so long operating from a position of weakness, the blindness, the dying, that you've forgotten how to think like someone with options. Get the cure, get your sight back, and then you won't be vulnerable anymore. Then you can deal with Demetrius from strength. And if the cure is another poison? If this is all just an elaborate way to finish what the first assassin started?" Have your healer test it first. Make the handover happen on neutral ground with witnesses. You're a king, you can demand safeguards. She made it sound so simple. Perhaps because, to her, it was. Humans lived shorter lives. They couldn't afford to spend months in political chess matches. They identified problems and sought solutions with admirable directness. Miss Brooks, has anyone ever told you that you're dangerously optimistic? Not in those exact words, but yes. Is it working? Perhaps. He stood, moving toward where he knew a window stood, feeling the burn of indirect sunlight on his face. If I pursue this, if I negotiate for the cure, I'll need leverage. Something Demetrius wants that would make him agree to modified terms. What does he want? Power, territory, respect. Valerius considered the political landscape he'd navigated for 2 centuries. He's always coveted the Silverwood region on our shared border, rich in resources, strategically valuable. If I offered him partial rights to Silverwood in exchange for the cure plus better marriage terms, would that work? It might. It would require me to give up something valuable, but not everything, a compromise from a position of calculated strength rather than desperate weakness. Oh. Then do it. Send a counter-proposal. Valerius turned toward her voice. You're very free with advice for someone who's technically cleaning my chambers. You're very tolerant of advice for someone who's technically a terrifying vampire king. Touché, Miss Brooks. She laughed, a warm, genuine sound that did strange things to his long-dead heart. For what it's worth, Your Majesty, I think you'll figure this out. You're too stubborn to die from something as boring as poison. Boring. Well, yes. If you're going to die, it should be doing something dramatic. Saving your kingdom from invaders, or falling heroically in battle, or tripping down stairs because I'm blind. That would be ironic rather than boring. Different category. Despite everything, despite the political machinations and the poison and the slowly approaching death, Valerius found himself smiling, genuine, unforced, the expression feeling foreign on his face. You're a very strange woman, Jenna Brooks. Thank you, Your Majesty. I do my best. After she left, Valerius summoned Theron and Lyris and began crafting his counter-proposal. By evening, they'd drafted terms that would give him the cure immediately, establish a long engagement period, and grant Demetrius partial resource rights to Silverwood. It was a significant concession, but it wasn't surrender. It was negotiation from a position of calculated compromise, the kind of deal that might actually work. He sent his terms west that night and waited. The response came 3 days later. Demetrius accepted the counter-proposal with minor modifications. The cure would be delivered in 1 week at a neutral location. The engagement to Lady Morgana would last 1 year, during which both parties could negotiate final marriage terms. Silverwood would be split, with the Western Court gaining access to the northern mines. It's too easy, Theron said darkly. He's planning something. Undoubtedly, Valerius agreed. But the cure will be tested before I take it. We'll have every safeguard in place, and once my sight returns, once I'm at full strength again, we'll see how Demetrius's plans fare against a healthy opponent. The week passed in a blur of preparations. Valerius continued his careful navigation of the castle, his memorized routines. But now there was hope threading through the performance, hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. Jenna found him in the library the night before the exchange. Your Majesty, I wanted to wish you luck for tomorrow. Thank you, Miss Brooks. Your encouragement has been unexpectedly valuable. I'm glad I could help. She hesitated. Can I ask you something personal? You may. When you get your sight back, when you can see again, what's the first thing you'll want to look at? He considered the question. His kingdom, obviously. His castle, his people, the strategic maps and documents he'd been navigating blind, all the practical, important things. But what came out of his mouth was, "You, I'd like to see you." Silence greeted his admission. Then, quietly, "Why?" "Because I've memorized everything about you except your face, your heartbeat, your scent, the rhythm of your steps, the sound of your voice and the warmth of your hand. But I've never seen your eyes, never known if you smile the way I imagine you do. I'd like to correct that omission. I'm nothing special to look at, Your Majesty, just a human woman with too many freckles and paint-stained clothes." I'll be the judge of that. He heard her move closer, heard the catch in her breathing. Your Majesty Valerius, I need to tell you something. Before tomorrow, before everything changes. I'm listening. I care about you, more than I should, more than is wise. You're a vampire king and I'm a cleaning woman, and this is impossible. But I needed you to know. Just once. Valerius closed the distance between them, reaching out to cup her face in his hands. Her skin was warm, her cheekbones high beneath his palms. He traced the line of her jaw, the curve of her lips, trying to build a picture from touch alone. Jenna Brooks, you are the strangest, boldest, most infuriatingly optimistic woman I've ever encountered. You've seen me at my weakest and treated me with kindness instead of pity. You've helped me survive when I'd half decided dying was easier. And you're wrong about one thing. What's that? This isn't impossible. Inadvisable, perhaps, complicated, certainly, but not impossible. He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle brush of lips that sent electricity through his entire body. She made a soft sound and kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. They broke apart slowly, and Valerius rested his forehead against hers. Tomorrow, I'm going to get the cure. I'm going to see again, and when I do, the first face I look at will be yours. That's a promise. I'll hold you to that, she whispered. They stood together in the library, human and vampire, mortal and immortal. And for a moment, the impossibility didn't matter at all. The next day, Valerius traveled to the neutral ground where the exchange would take place, an old cathedral that belonged to neither court, situated exactly halfway between their territories. He brought Theron, Lyris, and a contingent of guards. Demetrius arrived with similar fanfare. The Western court lord was everything his reputation suggested. Tall, ancient, with the white hair and pale skin of pure vampire blood. Valerius tracked him by sound and scent, maintaining the fiction of sight through carefully practiced head movements and strategic positioning. Valerius, Demetrius said, his voice carrying amusement, you look well for someone supposedly poisoned and dying. I'm resilient, you should remember that. Indeed. Shall we proceed with the exchange? Selena stepped forward, holding an ornate crystal vial filled with silver liquid. The cure, as promised. It will restore all senses lost to the poison and purge the toxin from your system. Lyris took the vial and retreated to examine it. Long minutes passed while she conducted tests, mixing drops of the liquid with various reagents, muttering under her breath. Well? Valerius asked finally. It's genuine, Your Majesty. This is the cure. No secondary poisons? No hidden toxins? None that I can detect. Valerius took the vial, feeling its weight in his hand. This was at the moment everything changed. He could drink this and restore what he'd lost, or refuse and die maintaining his pride. Jenna's words echoed in his mind. You're too stubborn to die from something as boring as poison. To new alliances, Valerius said, and drank the entire vial in one swift motion. The effect was immediate and excruciating. Fire raced through his veins, burning and rebuilding, purging and restoring. He felt his senses slam back online like switches being thrown. First taste, copper and magic on his tongue, then smell, suddenly overwhelming with a rush of information, then light, color, vision. Valerius gasped, staggering as sight returned in a flood of visual information his brain had to relearn how to process. Shapes resolved into people, shadows became details, and the world snapped into focus with painful clarity. He saw Demetrius watching him with calculating eyes, saw his own guards, tense and ready, saw the cathedral around them, all soaring arches and stained glass. And he saw that this had all been a test. Impressive, Demetrius said slowly. I had wondered if the rumors were true, if you'd really been operating blind all this time. Your performance was flawless, Valerius. I'm almost disappointed the cure worked. Disappointed? I was curious to see how long you could maintain the deception. But this is better, I suppose. A healthy ally is more useful than a dying enemy. Demetrius stepped forward, extending his hand. To new alliances indeed, and to worthy opponents. Valerius shook his hand, understanding flooding through him. The poison, the test, the cure. It had all been Demetrius's way of measuring him, of seeing if he was strong enough to be worth allying with. Vampire politics were nothing if not convoluted. My sister will arrive next month for the formal engagement, Demetrius continued. Try to act pleased to see her. I'll do my best. The meeting concluded with formal agreements and signed documents. Valerius maintained his composure throughout, but inside he was reeling from sensory overload. Everything was too bright, too detailed, too much. But it was glorious. The return journey to his castle seemed to take forever. Valerius kept getting distracted by sights he'd taken for granted, before losing them the play of light through trees, the colors of the sky, the faces of his guards. When they finally arrived home, he went immediately to find Jenna. He found her in the library, of course, dusting shelves with methodical care. She turned at his approach, and Valerius finally saw her face. Freckles, just as she'd said, dozens of them scattered across her nose and cheeks like constellations, brown eyes that went wide when they met his, hair the color of autumn leaves pulled back in a practical braid, paint stains on her sleeves from some artwork he'd never known about. She was beautiful. Your Majesty, she breathed. It worked. You can see. I can see. He moved closer, drinking in every detail. And you were wrong. About what? About being nothing special to look at. You're extraordinary. She blushed. He could see the color rise in her cheeks, could see the way her eyes brightened with emotion. You're biased. Perhaps I don't particularly care. He kissed her again, properly this time, with the ability to see her face, to watch her eyes flutter closed, to witness the smile that curved her lips afterward. So what happens now? She asked quietly. You're engaged to a vampire princess. I'm still just a cleaning woman. Now, Valerius said firmly, we figure out how to make this work. I have a year before any marriage happens, and a lot can change in a year. Engagements can be broken, alliances renegotiated. I didn't survive poison and blindness just to give up on something important. I'm important. Jenna Brooks, you're the person who convinced me to live. Yes, you're important. She laughed, the sound mixing joy and disbelief. This is insane. Completely. But I've spent centuries being sensible. Perhaps it's time to try insane. Over the following months, Valerius navigated the delicate political situation with the same determination he'd used to navigate his castle blind. He negotiated with Demetrius, who proved surprisingly amenable to modifying the engagement terms. It seemed he'd only wanted to secure an ally, not force an unwanted marriage. Lady Morgana, when she arrived, was equally relieved to discover the engagement was more political formality than romantic arrangement. She had her own lover in the Western court and was delighted to help stage a mutually agreeable dissolution of the betrothal. The political maneuvering took time, diplomacy, and several concessions Valerius wouldn't have been able to make from a position of weakness. But from strength, with his senses restored and his kingdom stable, he could negotiate on his own terms. 8 months after receiving the cure, the engagement was formally dissolved by mutual agreement. Demetrius gained permanent trade rights to Silverwood's northern region. Valerius gained a powerful ally and the freedom to choose his own future. He chose Jenna. The scandal was immediate and intense. A vampire king marrying a human commoner? Unthinkable, unprecedented. Various nobles lodged formal protests. Valerius ignored them all. Let them protest, he told Jenna as they stood together in the ballroom where she'd first taught him to dance blind. I've survived assassination, poison, blindness, and vampire politics. I can certainly survive some disapproving nobles. You're sure about this? Jenna asked, though her hand was firmly clasped in his. Once we're married, there's no going back. You'll be bound to a mortal with a limited lifespan. I'm aware. Are you trying to talk me out of this? No, just making sure you've thought it through. Jenna, I've had months to think. Months of being able to see you, of watching you move through the world with kindness and courage. Months of falling more deeply in love with you. I've thought it through extensively. Good? She smiled, that smile he'd imagined during his blind months but never quite pictured correctly. Reality was better than imagination. Because I love you too, you stubborn vampire king. Say it again. I love you. Once more. I love you, Valerius Whitethorne, and I'm going to keep loving you even when you're being dramatic about it. He kissed her, there in the ballroom where they'd danced in darkness, where she'd helped him survive his most vulnerable time, where everything had truly begun. The wedding took place on the winter solstice, in the same cathedral where Valerius had received the cure. It was smaller than a royal wedding should have been. Many nobles refused to attend, but everyone who mattered was there. Lyra stood as witness, still grumbling about the political complications. Theron provided security while trying to hide his approval. Even Demetrius sent an expensive gift and a note congratulating Valerius on choosing chaos. Jenna wore a simple dress in deep blue that made her eyes shine. Valerius wore formal vampire court attire, all silver and black, but couldn't stop smiling, an expression his court was still adjusting to seeing. "I, Valerius Whitethorne, take you, Jenna Brooks, to be my wife," he said clearly. "In sight and in blindness, in strength and in weakness, in immortality and mortality. I promise to memorize every step with you, to never take a single moment for granted, and to love you with everything I am." Jenna's vows were simpler. "I promise to help you see what matters, to stand by your side, and to keep putting Jasmine in your bedroom even when you complain about it." The assembled guests, the ones who'd bothered to attend, laughed at that, and Valerius kissed his wife while his heart, that organ that had beaten unchanged for 2 centuries, finally felt fully alive. The months that followed were an adjustment for everyone. The vampire court slowly accepted their new queen, won over by her genuine warmth and unflinching courage. Jenna learned to navigate vampire politics with the same directness she'd used to convince Valerius to seek the cure, and proved surprisingly effective at diplomatic negotiations. "Humans live shorter lives," she explained to a recalcitrant border lord. "We don't have time for centuries of posturing. So let's resolve this dispute in a way that benefits everyone, shall we?" Valerius fell more in love with her every day. They established new traditions, blending human and vampire customs. The castle became warmer, more welcoming, with Jenna's touches throughout. She continued to place flowers in strategic locations, now purely for aesthetics rather than navigation aids, but Valerius appreciated them regardless. One evening, nearly a year after their wedding, they stood together in the ballroom. Music played softly. They'd hired musicians for the evening, and Valerius held his wife in his arms as they danced. "Do you remember when I taught you to waltz?" he asked. "When I was blind and pretending I wasn't?" "I remember. You were very patient with my stumbling." "You weren't stumbling. You were learning." He spun her gently, watching her dress flare out. "I never thanked you properly." "For what?" "For seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for believing I was strong when I felt weakest, for convincing me that living was worth the complications." Jenna reached up to cup his face, her touch as warm as always. "You saved yourself, Valerius. I just reminded you that you could." "Then thank you for the reminder." He kissed her forehead, her nose, her lips. "I love you, Jenna Whitethorne. I love you too. Even though you still get dramatic about things. It's part of my charm." "It really isn't." They laughed together, dancing in the ballroom where everything had begun, and Valerius marveled at how completely his life had transformed. A year ago, he'd been dying in darkness, performing a role to hide his weakness. Now he lived in light, with a woman who'd helped him find strength he'd forgotten he possessed. The curse was broken, the poison purged, the blindness cured. But more than that, the isolation he'd wrapped himself in for centuries had finally lifted. He'd learned to trust, to accept help, to admit vulnerability without it destroying him, all because a human cleaning woman had been bold enough to rearrange his flowers and call him out on his stubborn pride. "What are you thinking about?" Jenna asked, resting her head against his chest as they swayed to the music. "About how I memorized every step of this castle so you wouldn't know I was blind, and how you helped me anyway, without ever making me feel weak for needing that help. You were never weak. You were adapting. There's a difference." "I know that now." He held her closer, grateful for every moment, every heartbeat, every breath they shared. "Thank you for teaching me the difference." They continued dancing as the music played, a vampire king and his human queen, bound by love and trust and the kind of partnership that transcended the boundaries of mortal and immortal. Outside, the kingdom prospered under their combined rule. Inside, they built a life together, moment by careful moment. And every night, Valerius made sure there was Jasmine in their bedroom, positioned exactly where Jenna had first placed it months ago, a reminder of darkness survived and light reclaimed, of vulnerability transformed into strength, and of a love that had grown in the spaces between sight and blindness. Years would pass, and Jenna's mortal life would eventually end while Valerius continued on. But that was a sorrow for another day, one they'd face together when it came. For now, they had this moment, this dance, this love that had saved them both. The Vampire King had hidden his blindness for months, memorizing every step so no one would know his weakness. But in the end, it wasn't the return of his sight that truly saved him. It was learning to let someone see him as he really was, vulnerable, struggling, and worthy of love anyway. And that was a vision worth more than any cure could provide.